This is Delhi. Please stand by for the next broadcast. This is All India Radio. History has famously marginalized the voices of women in the freedom struggle. But even within that paradigm, lesser known are the contributions of courtesans or Tawaifs. Today, in the National Programme of Features, in line with Azadi Ka Amrit Mahotsav, we bring you a feature titled Telling Her Tales, the Belittled Courtesans of India, showcasing the history of Tawaifs, their immense contribution to India's classical art forms, and the role they played in the freedom struggle of India.
History has witnessed that the courtesans have been the custodians of the highest form of art. At a time when society was extremely patriarchal and it was not acceptable for women to be educated and they weren't allowed to step outside their homes, a time when women were raised to be married and their homeliness defined their character, the courtesans were a community of women who travelled, performed in public spaces, earned for their family and troops, and they were well educated and trained in their practice of performing arts. Known as Tawaifs in the north, Devadasis in the south, Baijis in Bengal, and Naikins in Goa, these professional singers and dancers in their glory days were at the center of art and culture in India and were proficient in both music and dance. They were respected by the noble elite and the royal courts of any given society. It is a popular belief that the Mughals started this courtesan culture. But is it really so? Let us try and trace their history and listen to what the renowned filmmaker, documentarian, and author Sabha Diwan has to offer.
There is no starting date as such. We do know that in the Arthashastra, which is, of course, from the Mauryan period, and in the Kama Sutra, which is from the Gupta period, there is frequent mention of singers and dancers and entertainers. And they had their specific roles, the ways in which that they were attached to the court, to the nobility, and they were actually recognized as citizens. They paid taxes, and they were accorded a certain status and position within society. But they were not called Tawaifs. They were called by a whole lot of other names, Natins, etc. Coming down in history, the women entertainers, women dancers, singers, and companions to men of the local elite. These were women, whose presence has been recorded through the early medieval period and into then Mughal history also. And these were women who did not observe parda. They were out of parda, unlike the quote-unquote respectable women, family women, who led very secluded lives. They were highly educated, not only in music and dance, but also in the letters. Many of the women wrote poetry. They were music composers, and they could hold their conversation because they had to provide companionship to the nobles, which their own wives could not, because the wives had been denied education, were in parda. So this is a certain pattern that one sees from Arthashastra onwards. Those are the written records.
Academician and author Professor Lata Singh tells us more about the fearless Tawaifs.
Some of the literary texts, from Buddhist Jataka stories to Jain literature to Sanskrit classical like Mishpatika, and you find the reference of Amrapali, Chitralekha, a lot of such references. So they had a high social position. In the medieval period, during the Mughal period also, they were now referred to as Tawaif. As you move towards the early colonial period, Britishers also were inviting them. Their journals, their diaries are full of references to Tawaifs, and they played a very important cultural role and, in their gatherings, and where even the Christian missionaries, did not approve of them, but definitely they considered the Tawaif as the intellectual section of women at that period in history.
मैं हूँ दर्द
A Tawaif was a shire's muse. They left their audiences spellbound with their performance of Kathak and by singing Dadra, Thumri, Khayal and Ghazal in their mesmerizing soulful voices. There are a number of tales in historical records about poets and shires who wanted the Tawaifs to sing their couplets. A courtesan performing a shire's poetry meant his stardom was guaranteed. Manjari Chaturvedi, the leading exponent of classical dance and the creator of Sufi Kathak, tells us about the agency that the Tawaifs enjoyed.
One aspect that we don't talk about is the poetry. Now, who was keeping the poetry alive in those times? The poetry was being kept alive by the Tawaifs and the Baitis because they were the performers. You know, today, who are the poets that you know? You would know Javed Akhtar Sahab, you would know Gulzar Sahab, you would know Prasoon Joshi. Why would you know them? Because Bollywood sings them. Their songs reach out to you. But there would be other 5,000 poets in India. But you and I don't know them. We only know the poets whose poetry is being sung by singers in Bollywood or Hindi cinema. Now, replicate the same situation to when we did not have Hindi cinema or we did not even have the recording facility. So what happened? At that time, the poets used to actually wait for the Baiji or the Tawaif to sing their ghazal so that it reaches the people, it reaches the general audience. And the Tawaifs actually ended up making the shires or the poets famous. During my research, I came across Mirza Ghalib and his association with the Tawaif. And during that process, I came across a letter which he had written to Nawab Sahib Rampur. Those letters are still in historical records and anybody can check those. Now, why I found that letter interesting was because in that, Mirza Ghalib mentioned to the Nawab of Rampur, sending him poetry and asking that please ask the Tawaif in your court to sing this for you. Now, I find it very interesting that a poet who we herald and we say that he is the greatest poet in this world is actually writing and saying that please ask the Tawaif to sing it for you because he knows that the moment this will be sung, it would have a different meaning and it would become more popular. It is very famously said for Begum Akhtar. I would say that in Hindi because it's said in Hindi that Begum Akhtar ne to kitno ko shayar bana diya. What it means is that she sang their poetry and they became very famous amongst the masses.
Let us hear more about Tawaifs and their agency in the words of filmmaker Sabaa Diwan.
Tawaifs were the custodians of Hindustani music and Kathak dance. They were the practitioners of what we now call light classical Hindustani music, which is Thumri, Dadra, Ghazal. Ghazal, of course, came in as a form only by early 19th century. It is they who gave it the form that we know it today. The greatest singers of Thumri Dadra, be it Siddheshwari Devi, be it Azizun Bai, be it Begum Akhtar, they all came from courtesan backgrounds. So that is a debt that we owe them in terms of that it is they who practiced and nurtured these genres of music. Similarly for Kathak. Kathak flowered initially in Lucknow court under the Nawabs. Then some of the teachers, the Kathaks, they moved also to Banaras and various gharanas of Kathak came into being. But who were the dancers? Who were they teaching? The actual dancers were all Tawaifs. That is again something that we owe to the Tawaifs because it was they who exclusively danced Kathak. Similarly, in terms of writing poetry, I mean, it's another matter that poetry has been relegated to footnotes and has not been given its due recognition because of the kind of stigma that in later times got associated with Tawaifs.
In patriarchal societies, the burden of morality lies on its women. Back in the day, the good moral woman was the one who stayed in the house, never demanded education, and followed what was told to her without asking any questions. But what about the Tawaifs? In the same society, the courtesans were a community of women who were confident, educated, independent, and they still enjoyed a very high social status. Over the years, the art, the content, and the performance of the Tawaif didn't change. Then why and when did the downfall of the courtesan begin? Let us hear what Professor Singh has to say.
During 1850s, the Britishers discovered there was a medical crisis, that how in the major cantonments of Lucknow and other places, they discovered that many soldiers were dying of venereal diseases. And they wanted to look for the cause for it. And initially they said it was the prostitutes who were giving them venereal disease. Prostitutes were now coming under the surveillance. They had to be admitted for checkups to the Lock Hospital, and the Contagious Disease Act got passed, and all the prostitutes now had to get registered. They were segregated, they were displaced from the main center. Not only the segregation, one of the famous hospitals which keeps on getting referred was the Lock Hospital, where these prostitutes needed to be checked. And, if they were found to have any of these disease, they could not move out of this hospital. Very derogatory way of checking the disease. And, if they had to escape, then they would be imprisoned in this hospital for more than 3 months. Bringing them under the culture of surveillance, till they found the number of venereal diseases are not coming down. And then they realize, that maybe there are other sections of people who may be responsible for this disease. Now, this section was the section of courtesans, the wives, who till this time were not under the umbrella of the prostitutes, but now these women were also brought under the larger rubric of prostitutes. That's the period when you have the cultural decline of this community.
Sabha Diwan offers some details.
The origins can be traced to European missionaries who, with the establishment of colonialism in India, came for proselytizing and came with a very different morality and were horrified at the place that Tawaifs and Devdasis occupied within Indian society, where they were given positions, they were given recognition, and they enjoyed a certain prestige. Tawaifs, for instance, in certain places were the highest taxpayers of their towns, like city like Lucknow, for instance. In their way of thinking and within the morality that they came with, especially this Victorian morality. So the art forms of the Tawaifs, Thumri, Dadra or Kathak, a lot of the content is very romantic in nature, also erotic, but it has to be understood within a certain context. But the earliest European travelers into India, they could not understand that. So they saw the Tawaif as sinful. They saw her art forms as obscene. And later on, especially after the War of 1857, this kind of stereotype became a convenient beating stick for the colonial rulers to beat, especially the Indian ruling class with, many of whom had taken part in the revolt of 1857, to say that Indians are inherently decadent and steeped in this kind of immorality and vice. That was a certain stereotype that was perpetuated to also serve colonial needs.
To add to the anxiety of the colonizers, the courtesans played a very important role throughout the freedom struggle.
They played a very active role. I think simply because Tawaifs are very well informed. They did not live in seclusion. They were not in Parda. They met a whole cross-section of people every day. And therefore, they were very well informed about what was happening, about the problems being faced by people. And so that knowledge obviously made them very sympathetic to the cause of the rebellion. They themselves had suffered so much at the hands of the colonial government, colonial laws, which in many ways it had denied them, for instance, their property rights. It had denied them the right to adoption. It had criminalized so much of their lifestyle that they had their own good reason and grievances to rebel against the British.
The courts of Tawaifs have always been the cultural hub of the town or city where they have been situated. From the nobility to the elite to the common folks, and later the British soldiers and rebels, all kinds of gentry visited the courts of Tawaifs. Manjari Chaturvedi offers some details.
Kota was a performance space where a certain artist, whether it was a singer or a dancer, performed. There was an audience that came, watched the performance and went back. So it was a medium for entertainment, and the space for entertainment was a physical space, which was either the court of the Nawabs or the Maharajas, or it was the kotha for, I wouldn't even say the general public, because even kotha was for the elite gentry, not accessible by everyone.
The kotas have always been a hub for exchanging information. People visited these places to indulge in conversations, along with art and music. During the rebellion, these spaces became a sanctuary for the rebels. Saba Diwan talks about how the Tawaifs were aware about everything that was happening in and around.
Many of them, the role that they played were as spies for the rebels because their quotas were in the bazaar. They had access to all the information that was coming. People could easily come into their quotas. Also, they provided shelter to rebels on the run. After all, they were public women, so men would visit them. And that did not catch so much attention. But they took a great risk at that point of time of doing that. Since they were also wealthy women, they also supported the rebels financially in certain instances.
Eventually, the British found out about the kotas being a regular meeting space for the rebels. Professor Singh has this to add.
The British officials were aware that these quotas were the meeting points for the rebels. They always looked upon them as suspicion. What you find, the quotas were attacked, the Tawaifs' property was seized. And in the 1857 revolt, if you look at the archives in Lucknow, you'll find a large number of these properties confiscated by the British officials because they said they had their role in the 1857 revolt. One of the novel like Ruswa's Umrao Jan also mentions that she left Lucknow for another place at the time of 1857. So maybe these quotas became not a safe place for the Tawaifs.
The Tawaifs' participation in the freedom struggle was more than just providing safe spaces for the rebels. A number of historical records have mention of Tawaifs picking up arms to fight the British alongside Indian rebels. The Gazette has a mention of Dharman Bibi, Tawaif of Ara, who accompanied her patron, a local zamindar, Babu Kunwar Singh, to fight the British alongside the rebels. Begum Samru gets acknowledgement in the official records of East India Company and that of the Mughal rulers as being the most dynamic military strategist. One lesser-known fact about Begum Hazrat Mahal, the wife of the Nawab of Awadh, Wajid Ali Shah, who is popular for her role during the revolt of 1857, is that she was also a Tawaif. When the revolt broke out in Lucknow and her husband was exiled in Calcutta, amongst all his wives, it was only Begum Hazrat Mahal who came forward and made her minor son the ruler of Awadh. She then led the revolt against the British as his guardian. The revolt of 1857 marked the most important event in the history of the freedom struggle of India. Another Tawaif of Kanpur, who played a key role in the movement, was Azizun Bai. Let us learn more about her from Saba Diwan.
There was Azizun who took part and fought alongside with Nana Sahib's troops in the siege of Kanpur. Now, in colonial records, Azizun is portrayed as this bloodthirsty, evil woman who supervised the massacre of British women and children. Whether she did or she did not, her exact role is not fully documented. But the fact is that within the Indian telling of her story, she is a heroic figure who acted as a spy, who took huge risks for rebel forces and ultimately was caught and was put to death by the colonial troops.
Professor Singh has this to add.
Though Kanpur has not been a very important seat of the Tawaif culture, but from some of the colonial records of that era of 1857, 1 year after the 1857, the British set up an inquiry committee to inquire about the whole 1857 revolt. And in that depositions, what's very significant, a lot of people are coming to that deposition. One is a lawyer of Kanpur in 1858, Nanak Chand. In his deposition, he says that there was a great daring of Azizun, who would be armed and present in the batteries with the 2nd Cavalry. We have a Trevelyan talking about Azizun on a horse with the pistols in the midst of the cavalry. Even V.G. Savarkar, in his writing, has mentioned Azizun, how she had put on a heroic garb. And nobody can forget her smile, the way she encouraged the fighting heroes, and anybody who would run away from the field, the coward, she would motivate them to come back to the field. One of the important aspect was she was very close to the Sepoy Shamsuddin Khan of the 2nd Cavalry, who was very close to Nana Sahib, who was a Peshwa and who was actually leading the rebel in Kanpur.
During the 200 years of struggle for independence, as times changed, societies changed. The struggle for freedom also underwent changes. The definition of morality changed, and so did the social status of Tawaifs. This also led to changes in the ways in which the Tawaifs participated in the freedom struggle.
The Tawaifs of Banaras, they held a meeting. The entire community got together and they pledged their support for Gandhiji and for the freedom struggle. But that has hardly been ever acknowledged or mentioned. Tawaifs like Vidyadhari Bai from Banaras, during the non-cooperation movement, wrote nationalist songs and insisted on performing them at every mehfil that they were invited to. She started spinning khadi and wearing khadi.
चुन चुन के फूल ले लो अरमान रह न जाए ये हिंद का बगीचा गुलजार रह न जाए ये हिंद का बगीचा गुलजार रह न जाए.
It does not mean if these women are leading unconventional life, it does not mean they cannot be patriotic. 1921, Gandhi met Gohar Jan and asked Gohar Jan to contribute to the national movement, to contribute to the fund of Tilak Swaraj Fund. And Gohar Jan held a concert in 1921 in Calcutta. By that concert, she donated 12,000 rupees to Gandhian movement.
What you just heard is a popular song from Kamal Amrohi's phenomenal movie Pakiza. In the seminal piece by composer Ghulam Muhammad and poet Kaifi Azmi, the song describes the contemplations of a courtesan in love, portrayed by the iconic Meena Kumari. The history of cinema in India is very closely knitted with the courtesans. Many Indian art forms reflect a strong cultural influence of the Tawaifs. Did you know that the first woman to act in a Hindi film was Fatima Begum, a Tawaif, who also became the first female director and producer by establishing her production house Fatma Films in 1925. Saba Diwan talk about Tawaifs being the first women leading the entertainment industry.
By late 19th century, the earliest actresses of theatre, when Parsi theatre came into being, which is late 19th century, mostly, men played female parts in Parsi theatre, but there were theatre companies that had women playing female parts too. And the earliest actresses were all Tawaifs. In theatre, there used to be interludes of song and dance. Who were they? They were all Tawaifs. Similarly, in terms of early cinema, especially the early talkies from 1930s onwards, all the major actresses, because this is talking cinema, that required proficiency of Urdu and Hindi. It also required a knowledge of music, of being singers, came from Tawaifs' backgrounds.
Professor Lata Singh tells us more about the fearless Tawaifs taking on these newer mediums of entertainment.
The cultural erosion, their decimation, physically, culturally, morally, shifted to the margin and stigmatized. So what was the option left for them, and that's the period when you'll find the Bombay cinema industry is coming up, and you'll find many of these Tawaifs now would encourage their daughters to go to the world of cinema because they did not want their daughter to go under the stigmatization. And one of the classic example is Nargis and her mother Azizun Bai, who was a very well-known Tawaif of her era and very educated, cultured lady. She did not want her daughter to be initiated into this culture. This is also an era when the gramophone industries and all are coming. And many of these Tawaifs are also entering because many of these male great vocalists of that era did not want to have their voice broadcast to an anonymous audience. So Goharjan Janki Bai, she became a mega star in the gramophone. In fact, her name would appear on a picture postcard in the matchbox in companies of Austria.
Cinema owes a lot to Tawaifs, from content to actresses themselves. Yet it painted them as poor victims of their circumstances, who needed redemption by a man, the hero, who would save her from her life filled with darkness and make her the respectable, good model woman. Saba Diwan has this to add.
The ways in which the Tawaif has been cast in popular cinema in Bollywood, one sees them as the fallen woman seeking redemption. This Becharipan, the victim who has been kind of waylaid or pushed into the kotha and wants her redemption, yearns to lead a so-called respectable life. That is one way in which the Tawaif has been cast, one image. The other image in which she has been cast is that of the scheming vamp figure who destroys families, the destroyer of family life, who lures away men, shameless. These are all the ways in which the Tawaif has been cast. And the culprit is not really Bollywood, actually. Bollywood is reflecting certain biases and prejudices which came into being, especially by the 19th century.
Manjari Chaturvedi offers some details.
Plethora of Hindi cinema where, the Tawaifs are shown are pathetic, because that is always a woman to whom the hero goes and he drinks there, he throws money at her. It is just a vision which is created, and we've all lived with that. In all my research of the paintings and the pictures in the later stages during the British time, the Tawaifs were covered from the neck to the ankles. And they had a dupatta or a veil which covered their head always. Now, I don't know where this hip-gyrating kind of association of Tawaifs came into Hindi cinema, because the Tawaifs actually historically performed Kathak. The only visible part is their face, their hands, and their feet. You don't see any other part of their body. So today, the outfit even that is associated and brought upon us is actually not an outfit that they wore. And most of the Baijis and the Tawaifs wore Banarsi saris. They sat and they sang. They covered their head. Now, what is so wrong with a Banarsi sari clad woman sitting and singing for you? Where is all this aspect about, like I said, titillation come into being? That has been what Bollywood has given us.
The Tawaifs of India had a glorious past, filled with art, riches and power. One couldn't imagine that the Tawaifs of India, women who lived larger than life, the celebrated and respected artists of any given society, had loneliness lurking in the shadows of a future where they would be forgotten from the collective consciousness. As we celebrate the 75th year of independence, let us remember the contribution of the courtesans of India towards our rich culture and the role they have played in the freedom struggle of India.
In the national program, you just heard a feature titled Telling Her Tales, The Belittled Courtesans of India. Narration was rendered by Sanjay Mattoo. The feature was scripted by Sania Hashmi and Aparna Bansal. The program was produced by Meenakshi Mund. A presentation of the Central English Features Unit. This broadcast came to you from the Delhi station of All India Radio.